It was supposed to be just another quiet night in the California countryside. But what happened there would become the starting point of the most enigmatic criminal manhunt of the century. Before we dive into the story, one thing needs to be said clearly. What you are about to hear is not just about murders. It is about a man who made silence his ultimate weapon, who used codes as masks, and who manipulated the press as if moving pieces on an invisible board. And pay attention, because throughout the video, I'm going to show you details that most people never noticed about the Z13 and Z32 codes, and why they might contain something the police could never prove. If this kind of deep investigation makes sense to you, consider supporting the channel. It helps keep this type of analysis alive. It was the dead of night on December 20th, 1968, when darkness enveloped Lake Herman Road. That isolated stretch of Solano County seemed to breathe slowly, like a sleeping animal. The cold air carried the smell of dry grass and stagnant water. Nothing there suggested a ritual of violence was about to happen. David Faraday, 17, and Betty Lou Jensen, 16, had parked the white Rambler in a gravel area near the pumping station. It was their first official date, and that adolescent calm would be their last memory before the brutal impact that would follow. Around 10:15 p.m., another car stopped abruptly behind the Rambler. There was no warning, no verbal threat. The man who got out of the vehicle was just a shadow condensed by the cold night. The confrontation was quick, brutal, most surgical. David tried to get out of the car, but a precise shot to the head felled him as he tried to stand up. Betty Lou ran desperately, her footsteps echoing on the dark asphalt, but she was shot down from a distance. 5 shots, 5.22 caliber casings, scattered like the silent signature of a cold and calculating mind. There was no robbery, no assault, just an exercise of absolute domination. The police initially classified it as a random attack, but what no investigator imagined that early morning was that this execution would be the prologue to a much larger gamma game the killer would control with the tip of a pen, not just with the trigger. 7 months later, when the July heat burned the roads and the investigation was already dragging on without answers, silence gave way to the most disturbing voice the West Coast press had ever seen. On July 31st, 1969, 3 identical envelopes arrived at the editorial offices of the San Francisco Chronicle, the Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. They were ordinary envelopes, addressed with irregular, childish letters. But the content, that was the real attack. The letters described the murders of Faraday and Jensen, with details only the perpetrator could know. He didn't just confess, he claimed them. And he did so with an almost theatrical arrogance. He compared the bullets from his gun to those recovered from the bodies, offering irrefutable proof that this voice was, in fact, the shadow the police were trying to reach. But the revolver was not his main weapon. It was the pen, and inside each letter was something more threatening. 1/3 of a 408-character cryptogram, the now infamous Z408. Strange symbols, circles, triangles, astrological shapes, inverted crosses. The killer ordered the newspapers to publish the code on their front pages. Otherwise, he would kill again on Friday night. And then comes the first disturbing promise. The deciphered message would contain his name. Panic took over the newsrooms. The police called in retired military cryptographers, linguists, NSA experts, and even amateur analysts. The hunt ceased to be physical and became intellectual. The killer's anonymity was hidden in 408 symbols, a challenge thrown at the nation's intelligence. But before the FBI could decipher anything, a couple of teachers from Salinas Donald and Betty Harden solved the puzzle in just 2 days. The text revealed no name. It revealed something worse. A manifesto about the killer's pleasure in killing. About his belief that the dead would become his slaves in paradise. At the end of the text was the first symbol he would choose as his definitive mark. A circle with across the crosshairs. If you're following along this far, notice one important thing. We're not just talking about a criminal. We're talking about someone who understood the power of narrative. Even before knowing his name, the press was forced to baptize him. And he knew it. The man who would call himself Zodiac didn't just want to kill. He wanted to be read. He wanted to be deciphered. He wanted to be remembered. And in a few moments you'll see how this self-promotion strategy would be this killer's greatest weapon, more powerful even than the blade he would use in the next attack. The escalation came on July 4th, 1969, when Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau were shot at Blue Rock Springs. Mageau would survive and give police the first physical description of the killer, a heavyset man in his early 30s, with a round face, driving a light-colored Chevrolet Corvair. Even so, the police had no name. No conclusive fingerprint. No witness who could guarantee something solid. Zodiac was winning, and he knew it. But nothing prepared California for what would come on September 27, 1969, at Lake Berryessa. A hot day, tourists scattered around the lake, and two people, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, enjoying the afternoon. Suddenly, a man approaches wearing a black executioner's hood, with the crosshair symbol sewn on the chest. He spoke slowly, with control and an almost frightening emotional distance. He tied the couple up with common rope, pulled out a kaiba knife, and began a ritualistic attack. Cecilia would not survive her injuries. Brian would survive to tell the story and would become one of the most important pieces in the attempt to assemble the puzzle. Before leaving the scene, the killer approached Hartnell's car, took a black felt-tip pen, and drew the crosshair symbol on the door, along with the date of his previous crimes and the current attack. It was a written record, made to provoke, made to be found. The next attack would be even bolder. On October 11, 1969, in Presidio Heights, a taxi stopped to pick up a passenger who would soon put his name in American crime history. Paul Stine, the driver, was executed with a single shot to the head. The killer then cut a piece of the bloody shirt and sent it to the Chronicle's editorial office. It was undeniable physical proof. Zodiac now walked the city. The atmosphere of the San Francisco Bay Area was completely transformed. Terror was no longer just in the rural outskirts. It strolled under street lamps, crossed residential streets, watched children going to school. Schools began canceling evening events. Mothers forbade their children from hitchhiking. The vibrant counterculture metropolis sank into constant paranoia. And then the killer decided to escalate even further. On December 20th, 1969, a live call is made to Jim Dunbar's program. The voice claims to be Zodiac. He demands the presence of the famous lawyer, Melvin Belli. The authenticity was never proven, but it didn't matter. The press was already dancing to his tune. This man knew how to control headlines. He knew how to manipulate conversations. He knew how to turn his silence into spectacle. And before continuing with the series of letters, codes, and police errors that allowed this ghost to perpetuate itself, a quick reminder, if you want to support this detailed investigation here on the channel, leave your like and subscribe. This directly helps produce deep content like this. Now let's continue. Because from here on, the story enters an even more complex spiral, a battle between unsolvable codes, technological failures, and an investigation that almost always arrived too late. Zodiac's war wasn't just fought on the dark roads of Northern California. It spread like a silent infestation through newspaper offices, investigators' desks, and the minds of ordinary people. With each letter, each threat, each symbol drawn in cheap ink, he enlarged his own shadow. The real attack wasn't the shots, nor the stabbings. It was the communication. He understood that the media was his involuntary accomplice, and that the police were always 2 steps behind, running to put out fires created by a man who seemed to predict every move. Radio stations repeated his name. Newspapers emblazoned his crosshairs on the front page. The public fed the myth with fear, speculation, and obsession. Zodiac knew that as long as he maintained this flow of letters and codes, he would remain in control of the board. And when he finally stopped, the silence would be interpreted not as defeat, but as victory. A predator with the coldness to disappear at the height of his own legend creates something much more powerful than an arrest. He creates a myth. Meanwhile, the police tried to cling to what they had: fragile physical evidence, incomplete fingerprints, contradictory descriptions, and a paper trail contaminated by curious hands. The fingerprints found on the envelopes and stamps were a concrete hope, but the technology of the time was almost primitive. Records were filed manually on cards, organized by the Henry system, limited to the borders of each jurisdiction. A fingerprint collected in San Francisco did not automatically communicate with Vallejo or Napa. Zodiac exploited this bureaucratic fragility with surgical precision. He attacked in different areas precisely to fragment the investigation and force the police to work in the dark. As the case became increasingly complex, some names began to emerge on the detective's radar. The most persistent was Arthur Lee Allen, a former Navy veteran, Vallejo resident, elementary school teacher fired on suspicion of child abuse. Allen seemed to fit almost all the superficial points of the profile: physical size, type of interest in weapons, his fascination with codes, and even geographical proximity to several crime scenes. In 1971, a colleague stated that Allen openly talked about killing couples and using the name Zodiac. But, in practice, none of that was enough. Alan's handwriting did not definitively match the letters. The fingerprints were not a conclusive match. The trail was always close, but never close enough. Alan was watched, had lockers searched, cars inspected, but there was never solid physical proof. When he died in 1992 of kidney failure, he took with him the answer to the question that tormented generations. Was he the Zodiac? Perhaps. Or perhaps that obsession with Alan was just another dead end in the maze carefully built by someone smarter, more patient, and more invisible. Meanwhile, science tried to advance. As decades passed, DNA extraction technology began to evolve. Researchers turned their eyes to the vinyl tape used to tie up Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berry. If there was any residue of skin cells, saliva, sweat, anything, maybe the case would finally begin to be resolved. But the problem was time. Almost 50 years of exposure, careless handling, and degradation turned a potential goldmine of evidence into a pile of mixed and practically useless genetic material. In the early 2000s, with forensic genealogy gaining strength, some believed Zodiac would be the next historical criminal to fall. If the Golden State Killer had been caught by DNA from distant relatives, why not Zodiac? The envelope of the letter sent to journalist Paul Avery in 1969 was re-examined countless times. But the profile found was partial, unstable, insufficient for any reliable comparison in genealogical databases. There was no match, no genetic line. A ghost leaves, no footprints. Meanwhile, the codes returned to the center of attention. Z248 had been deciphered, but Z340 would remain a monument to frustration for over 50 years. For decades, the NSA, FBI, civilian and amateur cryptographers tried various techniques. Nothing seemed to work. The code resisted as if it had been specifically designed to challenge entire generations. And maybe it was. It was only in 2020 that Z340 was finally broken. 3 civilians, Australian, an American, and a Belgian discovered the key by combining modern techniques with an unconventional approach. The decoded message again spoke of slaves in the afterlife, of mocking the police, of his belief in his own invincibility. But again, no name, no address, no concrete clue. It was as if the killer had foreseen that one day technology would advance enough to break the code and would still leave only smoke. The deciphering of Z340 only served to reinforce an even greater obsession with the smaller codes. Z13 and Z32. Z13, according to many experts, was supposed to reveal the killer's name. 13 characters, supposedly a simple substitution cipher, but no consistent pattern ever emerged. Some say the code is unsolvable because the killer didn't use any real language, just a private sequence of meaningless letters. If this is true, then the name could never have been discovered. It was an intellectual trap, built to seem solvable, but leading nowhere. Z32, on the other hand, seemed to be more than a name. It seemed to be a clue. Many believe the 32 characters were coded instructions for a specific geographic location, perhaps a grave, a body dump, a place where the killer wanted to be found, or where he wanted something to be discovered. But, to this day, no interpretation has withstood scrutiny. The key, if it ever existed, may have died with him. All of this leads to a disturbing conclusion. Zodiac was just a criminal who escaped the police. He was an architect of myths. He built a maze with several entrances, several false paths, and no exit. He understood that if he stopped killing and just wrote, he would create a paradox. The more letters he sent, the more evidence he left. But when he finally stopped, he would leave only questions. And that's exactly what he did. After 1974, Zodiac practically disappeared. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't identified. He simply stopped. And here's an important detail. Many believe Zodiac could have died, suffered an accident, moved states, or simply grown tired of his own public persona. But there is an even darker theory that he continued operating, but without signing the crimes. He abandoned the crosshairs symbol, abandoned the letters, abandoned the spectacle. Serial killers, those who think, plan, and manipulate, don't always stop because of remorse. Sometimes they stop because they found something new to satisfy the same impulse. The last confirmed letter, in March 1971, contained a disturbing phrase. He said he had been stopped by the police and talked with the officers for 3 minutes, describing the conversation with pride. This claim was never verified, but it doesn't matter. The psychological impact worked. It was another demonstration that he understood the vulnerability of institutions. He knew how to manipulate not only people, but entire systems. If you're immersed in this story this far, It's worth reinforcing. This kind of deep investigation only happens on this channel because you follow along. If you want to help, leave a like, and it literally makes the algorithm show this video to more people interested in real mysteries. By now, years have passed, but the myth kept growing. Investigators like Dave Toschi and Ken Narlow dedicated decades of their lives to this figure, who always seemed to slip through the cracks. They weren't just hunting a criminal. They were trying to decipher a mind that operated like a walking enigma. Zodiac wasn't just the killer, he was the game. And from here, the story dives even deeper into the maze. The struggle between insufficient technology, failed coordination between police departments, letters contaminated by different hands, and a paper trail that, even today, seems to mock modern criminology. The police's mistakes, as uncomfortable as they may be, need to be exposed to understand the real dimension of this case. We're not talking about an incompetent force, but a system that simply wasn't prepared to deal with a killer who understood, with surgical precision, how to exploit structural flaws. California, in the late 1960s, had departments that practically operated as islands. Communication between Vallejo, Benicia, Napa, and San Francisco was slow, bureaucratic, and, in some cases, non-existent. There were no unified databases, no automatic sharing of information, no central coordination. Zodiac took advantage of this as if he were reading an instruction manual. When the letter envelopes were collected, for example, many of them had already been handled by journalists, secretaries, and even curious people inside the newsrooms. Fingerprints, saliva from ceiling, hair strands of that which could have been pure gold for forensic investigation, became contaminated material. On one of the envelopes, even police fingerprints were found, making any solid conclusion impossible. The crime scene of Paul Stine, the murdered taxi driver, had an unforgivable detail. Officers on the scene cleaned part of the evidence before photographers arrived, removing marks that could have been crucial. And, to make matters worse, a communication error led agents to look for a black suspect. When the description provided by witnesses clearly spoke of a white man, precious minutes were wasted, minutes in which the killer calmly walked into the darkness of the Presidio Heights neighborhood, without any obstacle. These failures did not erase the dedication of the investigators, but they helped create the perfect ground for Zodiac to become what he is today, a historical enigma. He understood that the police were not coordinated enough to face him. He attacked in different cities, different counties, different contexts. This was no accident. It was strategy. If there is anything close to genius in this case, it lies precisely in this. He turned institutional defects into part of his method. The letters kept coming, always with a tone of contempt and superiority. In one of them, sent in 1969, he included the famous bomb diagram, a blueprint of a supposed explosive device that, according to him, would be used to attack a school bus. The drawing had calculations, circuits, and instructions, but it was never known if he ever actually built any bomb. Many believe it was all just more psychological theater, a way to turn parents and teachers into involuntary participants in his narrative of fear. He described how he would position a bomb by the roadside, how he would trigger it, and how he would watch the bus explode. But none of that happened. Perhaps it was a lie. Perhaps it was true. Perhaps he just didn't find the opportunity. The fact is that the mere statement of the threat was enough to change entire routines and turn the daily school life into a territory of anxiety. Other letters brought grotesque illustrations, like the macabre Halloween card sent to journalist Paul Avery, accompanied by the phrase, "You are doomed." Avery, who had devoted himself obsessively to the case, saw his life turn into a whirlwind after this warning. Although there was no direct attack against him, the threat worked as intended. It generated fear. And fear was always Zodiac's favorite raw material. Meanwhile, another important piece of the story unfolded. The witnesses who saw the killer up close. Michael Mago described the shooter as a heavy-set man, with a round face and short hair. The 3 children who saw the killer in Paul Stine's taxi confirmed the appearance. White, about 30 to 45 years old, thick-rimmed glasses, ordinary clothes. Brian Hartnell, although attacked with a hood covering the attacker's face, described the tone of voice and methodical behavior as something cold and calculated. Even so, the descriptions varied enough that dozens of suspects could fit. For years, hundreds of names were analyzed. None fit perfectly. And while the police struggled with broken clues, the killer seemed to be enjoying himself. There is an almost ironic detail in all this. Zodiac's later letters show subtle changes in personality. Initially arrogant, theatrical, and full of energy, he becomes sarcastic, more tired, almost indifferent. Some experts believe this is a clear indication that he was aging, perhaps even dealing with some illness. Others think it was just another artificial attempt to deceive the police with the illusion of weariness. But none of this prevented new theories from emerging over the years. One of the most debated involves the possibility that the murder of Sherry Jo Bates in 1966 in Riverside was the work of Zodiac years before the official attacks. The letter sent to the Riverside Police Department, titled The Confession, described the murder in detail. The handwriting had similarities with later letters. The signature resembled the characteristic patterns of early Zodiac. But, again, the key piece was missing: definitive proof. The Bates case remains officially unlinked to Zodiac, but many veteran investigators believe that murder was, in fact, Chapter 0, a prototype of everything that would come later. Other possible connections include cases in Nevada, Oregon, and even Washington. The geographic scope of the discussion shows how much Zodiac transcended the condition of a suspect and transformed into an archetype. What begins as an investigation ends as mythology. And when we talk about mythology, we need to remember the role of the codes. They weren't just mathematical puzzles or linguistic exercises. They were manifestations of the killer's mind. Z213, for example, contains repeated symbols and graphic elements that resemble cryptographic signatures. But many believe there is no solution because the code was deliberately built without a key. In other words, he never intended to reveal his name. He only pretended to create perpetual frustration. Z32, on the other hand, is seen by some experts as an encrypted map, perhaps a location linked to the bomb threat on a bus. But the lack of context, coupled with the absence of a complementary message, makes any interpretation pure speculation. As the years passed, the case ceased to be merely police-related and became cultural. Movies, books, independent investigations, forums, documentaries, podcasts. Zodiac lives in every analysis, every theory, and every debate that tries, piece by piece, to reconstruct the mental labyrinth he created. The obsession with solving the case became part of the case itself. His figure survives because we keep trying to decode him. And at this point, before we enter the final phase of the scriptware, we talk about modern attempts to solve the case, technological advances, and the latest investigations. It's important to remember that this type of content only exists because you are here, watching, following, diving deep. If you want to help the channel grow and continue bringing deep stories like this, consider subscribing now. It's simple for you, but it makes a huge difference in keeping this work alive. Now let's go on, because what comes next involves cutting-edge technology, modern and revelations many people have never heard, including about new suspects, updated genetic profiles, and independent investigations that reignited the case even decades later. We now enter the most intriguing phase of the story, the modern era of investigations. Decades had passed, but Zodiac's shadow still loomed over investigators, journalists, forensic analysts, and enthusiasts. Technology advanced, but the silence left by the killer challenged even the most modern equipment. And this raises a difficult question. Is the case really closer to being solved? Or are we facing an enigma designed to remain unsolvable? When DNA techniques began to evolve in the late 1990s and early 2000s, many believed it was only a matter of time until Zodiac would be revealed. The expectation grew even more after the capture of historical criminals like BTK and, especially, the Golden State Killer, caught through genetic genealogy. If a killer, who acted for decades, changing regions and methodologies, could be traced through a family DNA chain, why not Zodiac? But it soon became clear that the situation was not so simple. The genetic material from the letters was compromised. In several of them, the saliva on the envelope flap was minimal, partial, mixed, and in some cases, non-existent, possibly sealed with wet sponges used by the newsrooms themselves. In others, there was genetic material from several different people, journalists, police officers, newspaper employees, all handling those letters as if they were a common office. Material not imagining that decades later, they would be central pieces in one of the world's largest forensic investigations. The result is that the available DNA was, at best, too fragmented to allow database searches or genealogy, and at worst, completely unusable. Even so, some efforts were made. In 2002, and again in 2007, partial genetic profiles were extracted from 2 different letters. These profiles, albeit incomplete, were enough to exclude some famous suspects, like Arthur Lee Allen. Frustration increased. The more technology advanced, the clearer it became that the genetic key might never be reliably recovered. It was as if Zodiac had, involuntarily or not, counted on the carelessness of the era to protect his identity in the future. But DNA wasn't the only evolving field. Another part of the investigation was reborn with force. The digital analysis of the codes, modern software, experimental artificial intelligence, and advanced cryptographic systems began to be used in search of previously invisible patterns. Z2340 was finally deciphered thanks to this marriage between human persistence and computational capacity. And this opened doors for new approaches, mainly regarding Z13 and Z32. Z13, although short, has always been intriguing. Zodiac himself stated, "My name is followed by the 13 characters." But what really catches the eye is that the 13 symbols seem too random, with no significant repetitions, no identifiable linguistic frequency, no structure. Some experts suggest the code wasn't a code but a provocation, a way to keep police and civilians busy with something he knew had no solution. Others believe there is indeed a name there, but encoded with an unknown key, perhaps even with multiple layers. A kind of personal riddle. The true meaning may have been lost forever, especially if it depended on intimate knowledge of his life, language, or habits. Zephyr 2, on the other hand, seems more systematic. The message accompanied instructions about a bomb supposedly to be buried in a specific location. 32 encrypted symbols, possibly related to geographic coordinates. Some analysts tried to link these numbers to maps of the time, roads, power points, trails, and even the Carquinez Dam. Nothing proved solid. One of the most respected theories says that Z32 only makes sense when combined with another letter, probably lost, destroyed, or never found. If this is true, then the code is incomplete and will remain indecipherable. Zodiac, once again, created riddles that depended not only on skill, but on secret pieces that only he possessed. As the technical investigations advanced, a new generation of suspects began to gain strength. The most discussed name in recent years was Gary Francis Post, pointed out by an independent group called the Casebreakers as a possible Zodiac. The theory made headlines because it included photographs, supposedly similar scars, and accounts from people who had lived with him. But, as in so many other cases over the decades, definitive proof was lacking. No DNA, no conclusive handwriting coincidence, nothing directly linking him to the letters or crime scenes. The Post case ended up becoming another chapter of intense speculation, followed by frustration. And here enters a crucial point. The Zodiac case is not just difficult, it is resistant. It does not give itself up. It seems to have been shaped to survive the passage of time. Every clue has contradictions. Every suspect has holes. Every piece of evidence has contamination. Every attempt at connection seems to lead to a dead end. And, over the years, this has shaped the public narrative in an almost mythical way. Zodiac became a symbol of the perfect criminal, not because he escaped justice, but because he knew how to manipulate time. He achieved something few have, turning his flaws into part of his legend. Notice that killers like Bundy, Dahmer, or Gacy are remembered for their crimes. Zodiac is remembered for the enigma. He fragmented his identity on purpose. And while the world tried to assemble this puzzle, he watched from the darkness, knowing he would never need to reveal who he was because the game he created was infinite. What remains today, over half a century later, is a case that still pulses. Retired investigators revisit files. Enthusiasts create independent databases. Cryptographers around the world continue trying alternative solutions for the smaller codes. And the public, fueled by movies, books, and documentaries, keeps returning to the case as if it had a life of its own. Zodiac is, in a way, an uncomfortable mirror of our own obsession with mystery. And before we enter the final part where we talk about the last official attempts, modern reassessments, and the psychological legacy of this killer, that quick reminder is worth it. If you made it this far, you probably like deep dives into real cases. So consider leaving your like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps keep this work alive and reach more people who enjoy this type of content. Now let's move on to the conclusion, where we deal with the cultural force that keeps the case alive, the most respected modern theories, and the question that echoes to this day: why has no one ever managed to completely decipher Zodiac? As we enter the final stretch of this story, one thing becomes evident. The Zodiac case survives because it never offers complete answers. It is not just a police dossier, not just a cryptographic enigma, not just a historical investigation. It is a presence, a mental space where doubt, fascination, and fear mix. And perhaps that is why, even half a century after his first attacks, the case continues to provoke heated debates, new theories, and a feeling that, at any moment, a new piece could emerge. In the late 2010s and early 2020s, several California departments began collaborating again in joint investigations. A special team was formed to re-examine old clues with modern technology. The hope was clear. If DNA couldn't provide answers, perhaps artificial intelligence, statistical modeling, and digital reconstructions could. One of the most ambitious initiatives involved digitizing every document, every report, every photograph, every fragment related to the case, and feeding this data into advanced analysis systems. The expectation was that previously invisible patterns would emerge. But the result was a brutal reminder of the complexity of this enigma. The contradictions, media manipulations, contaminations, and deceptions made it almost impossible to reconstruct a solid picture without falling into hasty conclusions. Even so, some relevant details emerged. A modern analysis suggested Zodiac may have used different personas in writing the letters. Changes in style, grammar, tone, and even pen pressure indicate that he deliberately varied his handwriting to confuse graphological analysis. This doesn't mean several people wrote the letters, but that one person wrote in different ways. If this is true, it means the killer had a level of psychological control over his own communication that few criminals possess. He didn't just write, he acted. He fabricated stylistic versions of himself, as if playing roles on stage. And this explains why so many handwriting comparisons ended up inconclusive. Another hypothesis raised, though controversial, is that Zodiac had an above-average degree of linguistic and spatial intelligence. He wrote like someone who knew grammar structures well, but also understood how to break them to appear less sophisticated. He used military expressions, but mixed them with childish humor. He presented complex bomb diagrams, but left intentional spelling errors. He created the constant impression of unpredictability, as if he were always one step ahead, controlling his own image while the world tried to decipher him. All of this suggests a very specific type of personality, someone who found fulfillment more in psychological control than in the physical act of violence. And this leads us to a final question. Who was Zodiac? The answer, as frustrating as it may be, may never be known. And not because the police failed, or because technology is insufficient, but because the killer built his own identity to be undetectable. He left false clues, misleading fragments, strategic self-contradictions scattered about. He made a point of becoming a puzzle without edges, a figure that could be anyone and, at the same time, no one. And this narrative construction, yes, narrative is perhaps his most disturbing act. Many believe he was an ordinary man, someone who may have died in the 1980s or 1990s, buried under a common name in any cemetery, without ever being noticed. Others say he may have lived until recently, following news, forums, documentaries, smiling alone to see how his shadow still dominates so much space in the collective mind. Whoever he was, one truth remains. He knew time was his ally. He knew that the absence of answers creates more obsession than any concrete revelation. And he used that until the end. The Zodiac case forces us to face the fragility of our institutions, the vulnerability of prodigital investigations, and the ease with which a determined individual can manipulate entire systems. It reminds us that truth, when fragmented and distorted, can become unreachable, and that the human mind, when exposed to enigmas, tends to fill gaps with imagination, creating alternative versions that feed on themselves and perpetuate themselves. Still, some people continue to believe the case can be solved. Perhaps one day a new genetic analysis technique capable of recovering material from aged paper will emerge. Perhaps some forgotten archive with information never made public will be found. Perhaps a relative of an unknown suspect decides to provide DNA for comparison. Perhaps an authenticated letter emerges after decades stored in some attic. Hope persists because the mystery persists. And as long as there is mystery, there will be a search. The most ironic thing of all is that, even if one day Zodiac's name is finally revealed, perhaps it won't change much. The myth, the fascination, the narrative, all of that has already taken on a life of its own. The Zodiac that remains alive in popular culture is bigger than the real person behind him. He has become a symbol of what we fear and, at the same time, what intrigues us. He has become proof that some mysteries don't need a solution to remain eternal. And if you've made it this far, breathing deeply, absorbing each detail, and diving deep into this investigation. It shows that you are among those people who aren't satisfied with simple answers. You want depth, context, history, and that's exactly what we try to bring here. So, before concluding, I leave my thanks. And, of course, if you want to help this type of content reach more people, leave your like and subscribe to the channel now. It really makes a difference, and is the best way to keep investigations like this alive and accessible. The Zodiac case remains open, not in police drawers, but in the collective imagination. It is an echo that doesn't fade, a code that resists, a shadow that was never fully illuminated, and perhaps that is his greatest triumph, having become, forever, the faceless killer that no one managed to decipher on the mystery that time couldn't erase.